There are things that settle into you before you permit them. They don't request entrance. They don't announce themselves through feeling or event or anything your memory can later organize into a clear beginning. They simply arrive, and by the time you recognize their presence, they have already made themselves at home somewhere beneath your awareness, rearranging things you never gave anyone permission to touch. That's what I keep returning to. Not the what of it. The how. The way something this significant moved through every defense I'd constructed without triggering a single one. Because those defenses were real. They weren't walls built out of damage. They were architecture. Precise, deliberate, and well understood. I knew exactly where every boundary stood because I had placed each one with intention. Nothing entered my interior life without passing through some version of evaluation first. That was never cruelty. It was simply how I maintained clarity inside a world that rarely offers it. The system worked. For years, it worked without exception. People entered my life through the space I allowed them. Some filled that space warmly. Others simply occupied it for a while before drifting toward wherever they were always heading. Either way, the structure remained. No one altered it. No one came close enough to question whether it needed altering. I thought that consistency was proof of something permanent inside me. Now I'm less certain whether it was strength or simply the absence of the right disruption. Because disruption never came. What came was quieter than that. Something shifted without force. Without announcement. Without a single moment I could identify as the reason. Only the gradual realization, arriving slowly over an impossible-to-measure stretch of time, that something inside the architecture had moved. Not collapsed. Not broken. Simply moved. Rearranged itself around a presence I hadn't accounted for and couldn't now remove without removing something that felt essential. I've tried to find the beginning. Everyone wants a beginning. A first moment. A turning point sharp enough to hold. But there isn't one. Or rather, there are too many small ones to separate, too many ordinary exchanges that seemed unremarkable individually and only revealed their significance in retrospect. Once enough of them had accumulated to form something undeniable, that's the honest version. I noticed something. I dismissed it. I noticed it again. I explained it away. I noticed it a third time and ran out of explanations that satisfied any part of my mind still interested in accuracy. What I noticed was simple and strange. You didn't feel like someone I was still becoming familiar with. You felt like something already known, already accounted for somewhere beneath language, somewhere that familiarity lives before history has had any chance to justify it. I don't have a rational explanation for that. I've looked for one with more effort than I care to admit. Nothing has held up under examination. Only the experience itself remains unchanged regardless of how many angles I approach it from. The absence of effort is what I keep returning to. Not because effortlessly is rare. Because this particular kind of effortlessly was. Most ease between people is borrowed. It's performed long enough to become habit. It carries the faint impression of work underneath its surface, of two people who once tried and eventually stopped having to. This was never that. There was no underneath. No evidence of prior negotiation. Just an immediate quality of space that neither of us appeared to be manufacturing. That made it harder to name. Things that arrive with obvious causes are simple to categorize. This had no visible cause. Only effect. And the effect was a kind of clarity I hadn't expected from another person. Not because I was seeing you clearly, though perhaps that too, but because something about your presence made me see myself more accurately. Less filtered. Less curated for the version of understanding I assumed was available. I hadn't noticed how much I was editing until the editing disappeared. It happened the way most significant things happen. Not all at once. In slow accumulations that only become visible once enough of them have gathered. First, it was the absence of hesitation in small things. Then the absence of hesitation in larger ones. Then the strange sensation, familiar but somehow new, of being inside a conversation that didn't require me to translate myself before speaking. Thoughts arrived at the surface still shaped the way they formed in the deep. Nothing lost in the distance between interior and expression. I used to believe that was only possible with time. That understanding required history, required accumulated evidence, required enough shared experience to build a kind of shorthand that made translation unnecessary. You disproved that without intending to. Without even, I suspect, being aware of it. Understanding simply appeared between us before we had done the work understanding is supposed to require. That unsettled me. I want to be honest about that. It was not immediately comfortable to notice something bypassing a process I had trusted completely for a very long time. Part of me searched for the flaw in it, the hidden complication, the thing that would eventually surface and make the whole experience ordinary, something I could examine and categorize and file away beside every other connection that had passed through my life, leaving things mostly unchanged. Nothing emerged. The longer I observed, the less ordinary it became. The more evidence accumulated, the less it resembled anything previous experience had prepared me for. And because I'm someone who trusts patterns above nearly everything else, that absence of familiar pattern told me something significant was happening. Even before I could name what, consistency was the first thing I recognized clearly. Not consistency in the shallow sense. Not the kind of reliability that simply means someone behaves the same way every time conditions are favorable. Real consistency. The kind that holds its shape under pressure. The kind that remains recognizable when circumstances change and familiar strategies no longer apply. Your words matched your silence. Your silence matched your presence. Your presence never contradicted the atmosphere you created simply by existing inside a space. That's not something that can be manufactured for long. Imitation requires effort, and effort eventually surfaces as tension. There was no tension. Only a steady quality of being that seemed indifferent to whether it was being observed. Not because you were unaware, I think you were more aware than most, but because awareness and performance had never merged into a single habit the way they do for people who have spent too long watching themselves through other people's eyes. I have spent too long doing exactly that. I didn't know it until I stopped, and I stopped without a decision. That's what still interests me most when I examine this honestly. There was no moment where I chose to lower anything. The lowering happened first, and I discovered it after. The way you discover a conversation has shifted in tone only once enough sentences have passed to make the shift undeniable. I was already different before I understood I had changed. Already more honest before I had decided honesty was safe. Already trusting before trust had been tested by any circumstance worth measuring. I keep looking for the explanation and keep arriving at the same incomplete answer. Some things precede their own justification. Some recognition arrives so early it exists before its evidence. The mind encounters something and understands it before language has organized itself into sentences capable of explaining the understanding. Maybe that's what this is. Recognition without precedent. Familiarity without history. Something the interior knows before the exterior has had any reason to agree. What I'm certain of is smaller than what I feel I should be certain of by now. I'm certain that something real happened, even if I cannot name it precisely. I'm certain that whoever I was before this began and whoever I am inside it now are not quite the same person, though they share the same memories and the same face. I'm certain that certain silences now feel inhabited in a way they didn't before. That certain words feel less adequate than they once did for reasons I don't entirely understand. That something I had compressed for a very long time has slowly been allowed to return to its original shape. That last part is the one I return to most often. The expansion of something that had contracted without my permission, over so many years and so many careful interactions, that I had forgotten its original dimensions. I thought what remained was the whole of it. I thought the edited version was the accurate one. I don't think that anymore. Some people reduce you over time. They require smaller and simpler versions of the truth until you forget you were ever anything more complex. It isn't always intentional. Often it's simply the limitation of their attention, their patience, their willingness to remain inside uncertainty long enough for something nuanced to become visible. Most people are not comfortable in the space between clarity and confusion. They rush toward resolution. They prefer a wrong answer to no answer. They choose the story that ends over the one that breathes. You never seem to need resolution. You seemed equally comfortable with open questions as with answered ones. That atmosphere changed something in how I moved through my own thoughts. I became less interested in conclusions and more interested in what existed just before them. The space where a thing is almost understood but not yet fixed. That space usually produces more honesty than any conclusion does, because conclusions end and honesty rarely has a clean ending. I don't know where this ends. I don't know if ending is even the right frame for what this is. Some things don't end and don't begin. They simply exist at a particular depth inside you. Below the reach of ordinary language, below the reach of easy emotion, in the place where only the truest things settle because only the truest things are heavy enough to reach that far down. That's where this lives now. Not in a decision I made. Not in a moment I can point to. not in a feeling dramatic enough to justify the weight of what it's changed. In something quieter than all of that. Something that requires almost no maintenance.